Good afternoon. My name is Winnie Stachelberg, and I'm the Executive Vice President for External Affairs here at the Center for American Progress. Just before we begin our program, please join us in letting everyone know that our thoughts and prayers are with those suffering from the devastating impacts of natural disasters here in the United States, in our territories abroad, and around the world. We hope for the safety and relief of individuals, families, and communities affected. Welcome to today's timely discussion regarding state and local actions to promote public safety and increase inclusion for immigrant and refugee communities across the country. Generations of immigrants have built and strengthened American communities since the beginning of our nation's history. But at certain moments in time, and we are in one of those moments today, we have experienced a pervasive and dangerous form of nationalism that has made strangers out of friends, neighbors, and beloved community members. The reality is that many immigrants who have come to this country seeking a more prosperous and peaceful life have instead become subject to the politics of fear and to policies that fall short of true American patriotism, one which welcomes the stranger and pursues the common good. Today, we'll discuss how state and local communities can rise above fear and hatred and come together to promote policies that support and welcome immigrants and refugees, and that doing so can become a core element of how they build and foster resilient communities. As a part of Welcoming Week, a national effort to celebrate welcoming policies across America, we are excited to partner with Welcoming America to bring you a diverse group of local voices who are standing up against divisive rhetoric and bringing others in to preserve the richness and vitality of America's neighborhoods. At the Center for American Progress, we have highlighted the dangerous influence of anti-immigrant groups on the Trump administration's immigration policy and will continue providing facts and research addressing the costs to the economy, to families, and to communities resulting from mass deportation policies, increased militarization of border communities, and expanded interior enforcement efforts. And based on the research we conduct here, this is what we know. Contrary to this administration's claims, research shows that undocumented immigrants are less likely to commit crimes than the U.S.-born population. During Trump's first 100 days in office, immigration arrests rose by more than 37%. Despite his campaign promise to deport only those with criminal records, his administration has made all unauthorized immigrants a priority for deportation, with arrest rates more than doubling for immigrants without criminal records. And nearly 6 million U.S. citizen children live with at least one unauthorized family member. Since the election, we've seen reports from across the country of spikes in fear and distress among young children because of fears of potentially losing a loved one to detention or deportation. With all of this increased enforcement, the administration's decision just 2 weeks ago to rescind DACA program and leave nearly 800,000 young people in limbo will have catastrophic human and socioeconomic consequences. CAP research has found that kicking DACA recipients out of the workforce would result in a loss of more than $460 billion from our national GDP in the next 10 years. In California alone, home to the largest share of DACA beneficiaries, removing the 194,000 DACA-eligible workers would cost more than $11.6 billion in annual GDP losses. For states like Texas, where we saw dreamers risking their lives during Hurricane Harvey relief efforts, we can expect $6.3 billion in annual losses as 108,000 workers could be removed from their labor force. Meanwhile, recent polls show us that Americans widely support giving dreamers the chance to stay permanently in America, including 73% of Trump voters. Allowing these young immigrants to stay in the United States is both moral and an economic imperative. Just this week, we released a new analysis which finds that passing the DREAM Act and placing all the immediately eligible workers on a path to legal status would add at least a cumulative $281 billion to the U.S. GDP over a decade, a figure that could rise to as high as $1 trillion if everyone who could be eligible for the DREAM Act is put on a path to citizenship. Today, we will hear directly from civic leaders and law enforcement officials from places as diverse as Texas, Iowa, California, and here in the District of Columbia as they share experiences and lessons with us. But first, it's my pleasure to introduce and welcome California Senate President Pro Tem Kevin de León. Senator de León's tenacious leadership has paved the way for smart, progressive policies that serve as national models. Just a few days ago, his Senate Bill 54, the California Values Act, deemed the most comprehensive bill to protect undocumented immigrants residing in the state, cleared the state legislature and is now pending Governor Jerry Brown's expected signature. This model policy would ensure that undocumented friends, neighbors, and coworkers in California are able to live their lives and interact with law enforcement without fear of deportation. But this isn't the first groundbreaking policy that the senator has worked on. In 2016, Senator de León successfully negotiated with Governor Brown and the state's unions to secure a $15 minimum wage law in California, and Senator de León was instrumental in the establishment of California's Secure Choice Retirement Savings Program, which assists California retirees and is a national model for retirement security. Senator de León is also a national leader on climate and energy policy and is the first Latino to ever hold the position of President Pro Tem of the California State Senate. Please join me in welcoming back to CAP California Senate President Pro Tem Kevin de León.
Thank you so very much, Winnie. I, too, want to associate my comments with yours. I want to echo, on behalf of the state of California, our deepest condolences to the people of Mexico. I've already been in touch with the governor, who happens to be, I believe, in New York or in Connecticut right now as we speak, to see what is it that we can do as a state to provide our next-door neighbors with assistance that are needed during this very difficult tragedy in Mexico, Puebla, Morelos, Oaxaca, and the state of Guerrero. We will be in touch as well tomorrow with the Mexican ambassador, Jerónimo Gutierrez, tomorrow here in D.C. So I thank you very much, Winnie, for bringing this up. Good afternoon, and I want to thank you all for inviting me to join you here today. I want to thank Winnie for the very kind introduction of my person, and I'm very proud to be here at the Center for American Progress, which has become a bastion of progressive thought and policy in less than 15 years since its founding. I want to thank you for the tremendous work that you do. Now, I can't tell you how valuable it is as a lawmaker to have credible, rigorous third-party analysis on issues like immigration, healthcare, as well as climate change. And as you know, the California State Legislature just concluded its work for the year. I'm biased, of course, but I believe firmly that this was truly a historic, productive session. From our record investments in public education and vital infrastructure like affordable housing, transportation, parks, and water, to our successful extension of California's landmark climate cap-and-trade program and the single largest investment in clean air in state history. We also took important steps to preserve the character of our state, the qualities that make California a very special place. From the outset, we made it clear that we would protect our people and our progress. And for obvious reasons, immigration was front and center. For those familiar with California's complicated history with immigration policy, from the Chinese Exclusion Act to Pete Wilson's Proposition 187 in the early 90s, which cut off access then to public education, healthcare, and other vital services for undocumented immigrants. You know, we have not always been as tolerant and welcoming to immigrants as we are now. But what's past is prologue. That difficult history has informed us each step of the way since. We learned our lesson the hard way. We know that tearing apart honest, hard-working families is not the answer. Separating mothers from their children is no solution. It doesn't make us safer. It doesn't bring back jobs. It doesn't solve our economic challenges. In fact, I would argue it does quite the opposite. It undermines our prosperity. It makes us less safe because it hurts the trust that law enforcement has worked so hard to build with immigrant communities throughout the country. That difficult chapter in our history continues to reverberate today. The California Republican Party still has not recovered from the backlash even after more than 20 years from Proposition 187. In fact, it was actually in response to Proposition 187 and the anti-immigrant animus wave in the 90s that I first became politically active. That was a turning point for me personally, just as it was for the state of California. And I believe that California is a bellwether for the nation on this issue. Of course, this president brought back those painful memories and exploited deep-seated tensions to win his office. And since taking office, we've seen some of his more detestable campaign rhetoric put into action, from the Muslim ban to the threats to defund sanctuary cities, and the most recently decision to end DACA. We knew we had to be decisive. So I took the extraordinary position, the step of actually hiring outside counsel. And that outside counsel is the former Attorney General of the United States, the head of the Department of Justice, Eric Holder, to help inform and advise the legislature on this issue as well as many other issues. And we set to work building a wall of resistance to the hateful, destructive, and short-sighted agenda currently prevailing here in Washington. We, of course, have filed a number of lawsuits in consultation with Mr. Holder, as well as our State Attorney General, former Congressman Javier Becerra. We expanded access to legal counsel for those immigrants residing in the state of California to ensure due process for all. And we passed my bill, Senate Bill 54, the California Values Act, also known as the Sanctuary State Bill, to ensure that California's state and local law enforcement agencies focus solely on their duty to protect and serve our communities, all our communities, regardless of who you are and where you come from, the hue of your skin, your native language, regardless of who you love. Senate Bill 54 prohibits law enforcement agencies, including school police, as well as security departments, from using resources, local tax dollars, and state tax dollars to enforce federal immigration laws. It also creates safe zones at our schools, at our hospitals, at our churches, at our courthouses, and other sensitive locations, so our immigrant communities can live their lives and conduct important business free of fear. It has been called the Sanctuary State Law, but I want to be very clear on the record, because I think that is a false characterization. It's a misnomer. There is no such thing as a sanctuary city or sanctuary state. There is no such thing as a false, invisible wall, and if you get right behind it, somehow, some way, you'll be free from ICE, deportation, or detention. The reality is this, and it's not lost on me, that the federal government has exclusive jurisdiction over federal immigration law. They have the right, the legal right, to enforce federal immigration laws that are currently on the book. But that doesn't mean that local governments or state governments have to be an extension or a cog in the Trump deportation machine. It doesn't mean that our local residents throughout the nation have to be double taxed. Double taxed in that our local tax dollars that should be utilized for our local police to protect and serve all communities are now being utilized to be an extension of the federal immigration authorities. We should not be double taxed, and we should not have our local police officers abandon their responsibilities, their duties, to help set up a perimeter around, say, an elementary school, waiting for mothers to pick up their children after school. That's not who we are as a great state. That's not who we are as a great country. What this measure really does is prevent the type of situation you had in Arizona with the disgraced Sheriff Joe Arpaio. It prevents law enforcement from arresting any person for civil immigration violations. It limits cooperation to ICE to only those cases involving violent felony crimes. And it ensures our public safety officers and resources aren't commandeered by the federal government for the purpose of mass deportation. This was a very hard-fought compromise with our governor, Governor Brown, in the law enforcement community. It's not as expansive as it originally was, but I do think the final product strikes the critical balance between public safety and protecting our values as a state that welcomes immigrant communities. We also secured $30 million for legal assistance for DACA students in California. Now, I'm under no illusions that these steps alone are enough to solve our immigration challenges. Clearly, there should be sensible limits on immigration, and it is the responsibility of the federal government to set those limits. We can all agree that we need comprehensive immigration reform, clear, predictable, and fair guidelines, which secures our borders for national security reasons and provides a pathway to legal residency and citizenship for our undocumented community throughout the great country. But we have a problem. The situation is we have a Congress who have abdicated their responsibility to do their job, to roll up their sleeves and actually get a comprehensive immigration reform package across the desk to the president. But let me be very clear. If the new president wants to wage a campaign of fear against innocent families, he can count us out. We will not lift a single finger or spend a single cent. We're not going to allow one election to reverse generations of progress at the height of our historic diversity, our scientific advancement, our economic output, and our sense of global responsibility. We will continue to use every tool at our disposal to protect all Californians until Congress does. The state of California today is the sixth largest economy in the entire world. We are the epicenter of innovation and inclusivity. And we didn't get there by embracing alternative facts or pseudo-scientific nonsense. In this state, the great state of California, we make policy based on facts as well as science. We don't govern by gimmick because you cannot run a global economy by stoking hatred as well as division. The great state of California is a beautiful mosaic. It's an amazing tapestry of so many different hues. Whether your ancestry originates from Scotland, the United Kingdom, Ireland, or whether it's from Mexico or Central America or Russia or China, Vietnam or South Korea or elsewhere. It's a state of inclusivity and diversity. And that is the key to our success, being the sixth largest economy in the world. Now, to put this in context, there are only 5 large economies in the world. The United States as a whole, in the aggregate, China, Japan, on a good day, depending on the fluctuations of the sterling, the pound, the United Kingdom, and then it is your great state, the state of California. And if you're remotely interested in rounding out the top 10, we have at number 7, we have France, we have Brazil, we have a nation that's been in the news quite a bit and will be so for the foreseeable future. We have Russia, and then we have Italy. So California's economy is larger than that of Vladimir Putin's Russia, to put this in context. And this is what it means for California, to embrace people from all over the world who want to come to our country, who want to come to our state, who want to work hard, who want to give their children a better future, who respect our laws, pay their taxes, and pledge their allegiance to the red, white, and blue. And that's why when you have a president who says we have 11 million to 13 million undocumented immigrants who are criminal felons, we know that to be an alternative fact because we know that to be not accurate. In fact, it's a narrative that Steve Bannon, Steve Miller, with Chris Kobach, and obviously the Attorney General of the United States, Mr. Jeff Sessions, have perpetuated for a very, very long time. But this threatens our economic prosperity as a state, our values, our progressive values, as well as our people. Now, this country is greater than any one man or party. And I want to finish by saying the following. To all the dreamers who have been betrayed by this president, let me end by saying to those dreamers who have been bullied, who have been demeaned, who have been downsized or told that they're dispensable just because they're different, whether that oppression came from a peer or a president. Know one thing, America is bigger than one man or one party. And America will always be an exceptional example where you can be whoever you are and you can dream of being whoever you want to be. With that, I want to thank you very much. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to invite the panelists to the stage now. I want to thank Senator de León for his terrific remarks. Thank you all very much for joining us for this conversation. My name is Tom Javits. I'm the Vice President of Immigration Policy at the Center for American Progress. You guys can sit, I think, wherever you want, probably. Joining me on the stage, along with Senator de León, are three terrific panelists who I think will have a really good conversation. And obviously, at the end, we'll have time for questions from the audience. Immediately to my left here is Monica Fuentes, the Director of the Washington Office for Welcoming America, with whom we've partnered to bring to you this event. After Senator de León, we have Liz Cedillo Pereira, the first Director of the Office of Welcoming Communities and Immigrant Affairs for the city of Dallas, Texas. And on the end of the panel, we have Mark Prosser, the longtime Police Chief and Public Safety Director for Storm Lake, Iowa. And for our viewing audience, or if you're engaged in social media right now in the audience here, you can join the conversation on Twitter with the hashtag #WelcomingWeek. And that we'll get to that in a little bit, but as we mentioned during Winnie's opening remarks, this is taking place in the middle of Welcoming Week, which is an event essentially that Welcoming America helps put on every single year to highlight the work being done in communities around the country. So I'm going to ask one question of each of the panelists here that's a slight variation on a single theme, but I think it's hopefully going to be an opportunity to kick off the larger discussion. So I want to start off, Senator de León, with a question following up on your terrific remarks. This was, as you mentioned, a very, very impactful legislative session. And the Values Act, California Values Act, which just got passed by the legislature last week, was the process of a lot of negotiation. And thinking through sort of the moment that we're in right now and what states like California are standing up to do in this current environment, I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about kind of what lessons you learned from that process that you could draw upon either for future efforts within your state or potentially could be useful for individuals in other states that may be interested in pursuing similar measures, understanding, of course, that the dynamics are different, obviously, everywhere in the country. But I guess generally sort of lessons you've learned for the other states to draw upon, and then if there were things in your own process that you can learn from for the future.
I think some of the lessons, Tom, was you do have to build a sizable coalition, a multifaceted coalition, not just immigrant rights advocates or those in the legal space, but clergy, faith of all denominations, not just predominantly Catholic, but obviously the Islamic community as well as the Jewish community, the Christian faith, coalesce, labor unions, obviously folks in the health sector, as well as the educational sector. You do need folks who are chancellors of universities, of college systems, whether it be community college or whether it be a private independent nonprofit colleges. You really do have to amplify a coalition. There's no doubt about it. It has to be multifaceted, not just exclusive to immigrants or immigrant rights advocate groups, organizations. Also, you have to engage with law enforcement. There's no way around it. You're going to have to engage what hopefully will be a very productive constructive engagement. I had the pleasure of engaging with the police chiefs of the major cities and small cities in California. Police chiefs tend to be more methodical. They tend to be more thoughtful, solutions-oriented individuals. Obviously, there's other facets or elements within the law enforcement community that are a little more highly politicized, a little more highly charged with the rhetoric coming out from the Department of Justice with Jeff Sessions that tend to be the sheriffs. And I say so because sheriffs are elected. They're not selected by mayors or accountable to a police commission or to a city council or city manager. But you do have to engage in very earnest negotiations. And then your own colleagues, your own peers within your own party, your own legislative branch, you have to engage them constructively and bring them along too. It's unfortunate because the dialogue is so xenophobic, so polarizing, so polemic that this has become sort of the modern 2.0 version of Willie Horton, of the way they have ostracized and used immigrants, any unfortunate tragic crime, and have really made the narrative such that these are all what immigrants do here in whether it's California, whether it's Texas and Iowa, or here in Washington. So I would say amplify your coalition, make sure it's multifaceted. You're going to have to engage and be respectful of law enforcement. You're not going to agree with everything. There'll be tough negotiations, things you'll walk away with, but things that I learned. One thing I learned very quickly is the multitask coalition between the feds, states, and local governments on issues of human trafficking, international drug cartels, as well as terrorist cells, how they can collaborate and cooperate. And you don't want an unintended consequence prohibiting that type of communication and collaboration, as long as it is not primarily for deportation purposes right there. So things I learned, and I said, I listened to police chiefs and others and say, you're right, I don't want this to be an unintended consequence. We have to fix that and change that, because God forbid we don't want to prohibit collaboration, cooperation, communication between the various law enforcement agencies if there is a terrorist cell within your own backyard. So these are things that I learned too, and I grew as a result.
That's great. That's very helpful, I think. Now, Director Cedillo, the question I want to ask you is sort of similar. You obviously heard the Senator's remarks about California. Texas exists in a very different environment. While the California legislature leaned in hard, I think, in this current environment to push for more protective policies at the state level, Texas has really gone in an opposite direction at the state level, let's say, right? So you've seen Texas, the Attorney General's office leading the charge against the DACA initiative for the administration with SB 4. That was the law that was enacted at the state level that would radically change the way that state and local law enforcement and other officials interact with their immigrant communities. Your city, Dallas, obviously was involved in a lawsuit challenging that law, and as a result of a different lawsuit, it's now largely been enjoined, although not entirely. I'm curious if you could talk a bit about, in the current environment that we're in, and that sort of involves the national conversation, but also at the state level as well, how are you approaching your job of setting up, right from the ground up, really, this Office for Immigrant Affairs, and what lessons might you be able to draw upon for other cities that are trying to set up similar offices in similarly difficult environments?
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for the question. Thank you to CAP for this very, very important and timely conversation. Really appreciate being a part of it. And acknowledge Welcoming America, really, because they are a standout national and now international organization that provides technical and otherwise support for cities, municipalities, states, regions who are interested in delving into this space. So it's more than just word, it's also deed. And how do you develop that programming around those deeds? And so Welcoming America has been a great source of technical support for our city, and we look forward to working further with them. We just received a grant for Gateways for Growth Challenge to look at our economy and how it thrives as a result of immigration and the labor force it's associated with. So we're looking forward to moving further into that space. And really, it was something that germinated over a 10-year period of time. I'm from Dallas. I was born and raised in Dallas, and was part of that advocacy community for a number of years. And led by the National Council of Jewish Women, in fact, 10 years ago or so, a little bit more, they went to our mayor and said, hey, we need an Office of Immigration Affairs. Let's do this. It's time for us to come together as a city and stand behind our immigrant brothers and sisters. Well, it didn't happen at the time, but the idea started germinating. Of course, like everything, needs to come to fruition. And recently, the mayor had a task force on poverty, addressing issues and root causes of poverty. And of course, some of that was, how do we get around services that will directly lift people out of a shadow, out of poverty, namely through citizenship workshops, ESL, other types of educational programming that would bring the community out. We have a large working poor population in the city of Dallas. So how do you support that so that they can move beyond existing and into economic success? So out of that recommendation in September of 2016, I think this office came to moving beyond the idea into a goal, into a new city manager who came on board, who came from a community where there was a welcoming office like this, and our mayor and city council getting behind us and say, let's be proactive. We want to grow our economy, and we know and recognize that 1 in 4 of us in Dallas was born in another country. Let's do this.
Great, yeah. And I guess specifically going back to the issue of kind of the current moment that you're in also in Texas, that's a very local, and I mean, I think it's really helpful because I think that's one of the themes I think of this conversation will be how hyper-local these conversations really are. And so looking at Dallas and the makeup of Dallas itself, that was sort of the origin story, I think, for this office.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you think about approaching your work and trying to build out those policies, given the larger environment around you in Texas and some of the forces that are at play there?
Well, it's as the senator said, you cannot operate in a state of fear. You have to operate in a state of what works for our local communities. How do we get around these issues in spite of rhetoric that may prevail in this time and age? So it's really about that, is working hand in hand with law enforcement, working with our city infrastructure, our libraries, our court system, et cetera, and really being, looking at it from the eyes of how do we be more inclusive? How do we include people who are such an important part of our local economy? 25% of our labor workforce is immigrant. So it's about recognizing those contributions, seeing it from maybe a different lens.
That is definitely helpful, yeah. Then we do have law enforcement on the panel, and Chief, I definitely appreciate you being here. One of the things we discussed in our earlier conversation was I was reading an article that Ron Brownstein put together on CNN last week, in which he described that states and communities that have the smallest share of foreign-born population tend to be the ones where you see the greatest support for the hardest line positions on immigration. And I think most of us think of large cities, I think, when we think of big immigration population centers. But you obviously are from a smaller town, Storm Lake, Iowa. And I was wondering if you could talk through essentially what your experience, what the community's experience has been with immigrants over the years. Right? It's been sort of my understanding has been a long process of immigrants coming into the city, coming into the town, Storm Lake, Iowa, and how they become integrated into their local economy, into your local community, and how that process has been essentially, and how that has affected also public safety from your role as the police chief there.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. One might ask why someone from a community of 14,000 people in northwest Iowa would be sitting on this panel and answering that question. And to your initial question as to why perhaps some states or some jurisdictions that don't deal a lot or have not experienced the beauty of diversity in their community might have a more hardline view of the conversations and the debates, I think it goes to the point of it's out of sight. It's not on their radar. They have not experienced it. Storm Lake's experience over the last 30 or 35 years is a public school system, pre-K through 12, that's about 82% non-Caucasian with 19 languages spoken in the classroom. We're not attached to any urban area. We sit in a corner of northwest Iowa, a community of about 14,000. Our adult English classes have 30 languages represented in that community. And so the conversations on immigration, shifting demographics, it's about who we are as a community and what we have become. In the Midwest, in rural America, in rural Iowa, we see communities with empty homes, closing apartment complexes, consolidating school districts. In Storm Lake, Iowa, we have newer schools that are overflowing already. Our challenges are we have a housing crunch and a need for more housing because our manufacturers want to expand and we just don't have the homes and the apartments to put people because the community wants to continue to grow. And so, in my opinion, as the police chief, that's a better problem to have than losing population. But all of that growth we've experienced over a period of 3+ decades has been immigrant growth. It has been a complete change and shift in the demographics of our community. And so no matter what the challenges have been, and our number one challenge has not been crime, it's been language, the ability to communicate with people and have the resources to learn their languages and to provide services to folks who we may not have the proper interpreters or translators for. That's been our number one challenge. Have we seen an increase in crime in our community in this time? Yes. Why? Not because of a change in demographics, the community's grown. We have more people. We have a larger population that push numbers up. We're one of the few agencies in Iowa that report out our crime stats by ethnicity and by gender. And we have never, in my tenure there of approaching 30 years as the chief, we've never had a year where there was any disproportionate representation by any particular ethnic group in crime. Pretty much rule of thumb, it doesn't matter what ethnic group you are, there's about 1% of people that require you to have a police department. And the rest of the folks are good, hardworking people. And I think that's the same in a city, large city, or a small town. And so this whole conversation is very important to us because our many different ethnic groups have brought us growth. They've brought us youth. They've brought us vibrance. The senator spoke of a mosaic. I was wanting to raise my hand. He was teaching some of the or sharing some of the very statements I've used in other presentations about what Storm Lake has become. And so we're very proud of that community. It certainly has its challenges, but the entire conversation now about immigration, whether it's a change in the impact on refugees or changing the DACA program, or whatever that scenario might be, has a huge impact on the citizens of our community, and they're concerned about it. And when your citizens are concerned, that impacts how they feel at work. That impacts their health. That impacts the children in the schools. And so our school administrators, our church leaders, our elected officials in our community are very concerned about it because it's been a great plus for our city.
I want to ask one follow-up question on that, because I think it's amazing to hear about the level of diversity that is now in Storm Lake, Iowa, something I think people don't obviously think about regularly. And that has been over a period of years. We talked about this before. Knowing sort of where you are now is very, very helpful, but also understanding how you got there, I think, could be enlightening for people as well. Can you talk through a little bit sort of what that process has been like over the last 30 years? I know you've been in government for a lot of that time. And you mentioned in a previous conversation we had that it's not always easy, but sort of what that process is like and how you've gotten to where you are today. What are some helpful programs or projects or other sort of initiatives, whether they've been government or nonprofit driven, that have helped to ease that transition?
I don't think we have enough time to adequately answer that, but it's been a learning process and a learning curve with successes and failures. I'll just give you a couple of examples that have spanned 30 years that I've shared with other groups. You know, in Northwest Iowa, one of the big social events were potluck dinners, whether they were at church or in your community or things like that. So as we started to experience diversity in our community, we created a diversity task force that will say, how are we going to adapt to the changing community and better serve the people? One note I would tell you about our diversity task force is it was all white. And so that was a learning experience. We were trying to make decisions and move forward for folks who weren't white and many came from all over the world. And so that in itself was a learning experience. But we started having, thought we'd have a monthly potluck dinner, bring neighbors, bring our new friends in our community, and in many cases, the folks from the different ethnic groups did not attend. And so through conversations, you know, we learned that culturally, depending on what part of the world you come from, that it's not normal to throw a party and then ask the guests to bring the meat. And so, you know, it was these little baby steps that you might imagine in a small community that we learned from. From a law enforcement standpoint, we had an evening, we had some criminal activity, and we required an Ethiopian interpreter. And we have had an Ethiopian interpreter that assisted our department, but he was a witness to the incident. And so we really couldn't use him for the purposes of dealing with the investigation. And so our night supervisor couldn't find an Ethiopian interpreter at 3 a.m. in Storm Lake, Iowa. So he called a Somalian interpreter, with the assumption, well, they're all kind of from the same part of the country, you know, completely done for the right reasons, but it was a learning curve, you know. And then all of a sudden the light went on. I said, well, that wasn't a very good decision. So we've had these types of incidents, and I could share a lot of learning, but we weren't afraid to learn, and we weren't afraid to learn by our mistakes and do better the next time. The next and most important thing that we learned is that our many different citizens don't do business like born and raised Caucasian citizens do in the United States. They don't come to city council meetings. They don't come to and voice their opinion in the mayor's office or to the police chief's office. And we tried some events that were failures of trying to take the show on the road to them, and they were failures because we didn't recognize what was going on in their lives. And so, making a long story short, we have really enhanced our community outreach and to the point where we now go and just set up portable offices block by block in the summertime, not there because of an accident or an incident or a crisis. We just roll in with police and other social service agencies and the fire department, and we'll just start knocking on doors. And we have the traditional pens and pencils and candy to hang out, because we found if you can get the kids there, mom and dad will soon follow. And just to create a relationship. And in the first few years, folks looked at us like we were nuts, but now they're coming out and they're sharing their concerns in the community and things like that. And doing that and using focus groups and not large events, there's more of a comfort level there in working with our different ethnic groups. So there's just one lesson after another, and we continue to modify those types of things. But those are just a couple of examples that we've learned over a period of decades in that small community of really dealing with an international clientele and international neighbors.
That's great. I love that specificity. It's really helpful to hear. So, Monica, you obviously deal with specifically this kind of technical assistance at a very sort of both conceptual but also concrete level. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about Welcoming America. It's an organization that builds bridges with local elected officials, with nonprofit organizations, community members, to build welcoming communities for immigrants and refugees. And obviously we're holding this in the middle of Welcoming Week. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about basically what we can expect to see in communities around the country as part of this week, but also how you all are approaching your work, again, in this current environment.
Sure. Thanks, Tom. And it's so great to be with such a wonderful panel. The police chief basically stole all my talking points in terms of how we do this work and how we kind of help local communities kind of come to terms with the fact that demographics are changing. So Welcoming America, we've been around since about 2009. And we were founded after our executive director did some organizing work in Texas. So back in about 2006, Texas was debating, Tennessee. I'm looking at you, Liz. Tennessee was debating passing a English-only bill. At the same time, Nashville, Nation magazine was calling it like the hot zone for anti-immigrant sentiment. Mosques were being burned to the ground, kids were being bullied in school. And what our executive director realized was no one was really having conversations with people about the fact that demographics were changing really quickly, and it might not be comfortable, that things look a little bit differently than you're used to. So, through that, kind of came up with a three-prong approach in kind of dealing with these issues. So, on the first, and again, to the point of the police chief, is you have to find ways for people to connect with one another. We have to find, you can't expect people to just change on their own. Like, some fears are reasonable. And when your neighborhood looks different than you've ever seen it before, it takes people to provide that opportunity for folks to get to know one another and realize that, maybe we are more alike than we are different, and that, we have things in common, and fostering ways to do that. It took a communications campaign, right? Thinking about the values of a community and how do you tie those values of who you are to how you treat your new neighbors. And also local leadership, being able to engage local leaders, whether it was mayors or business leaders or faith leaders, really helped kind of build a coalition to really kind of change the tone in the community. And what ended up happening is this bill failed. But not only that, a few years later, the Nashville Chamber of Commerce noted that Nashville was vibrant, booming for business in a way it had never before, and in part was due to the fact that they were a welcoming community that was celebrating their diversity and making it a place that people wanted to bring their talents to Nashville. So you fast forward a couple years, Welcoming America comes to be, really taking those lessons from a place like Nashville, Tennessee, that with looking at things like finding ways for people to build bridges, working with local leaders, and thinking about how you talk about these issues of diversity, you can really start making some of those changes and really making communities a place where immigrants and refugees can thrive. Our theory of change is that if we really want immigrants and refugees to thrive in a community, you have to engage the people who already live there. And whether those are the long-term neighbors, whether it's the government leaders, business leaders, educators. If we really want socially cohesive and economically vibrant places, it doesn't happen overnight. And it's going to take that engagement of everyone that lives there. So we work with about 200 different communities across the country, 100 local governments, from places as diverse as Dallas, Texas, to San Jose, California, LA, places in Iowa. You just mentioned Des Moines earlier when we were talking in the back, to Dayton, Ohio, which is our first welcoming certified city, Anchorage, Alaska, Salt Lake, Fargo, North Dakota. And the reason I mention all these places is because what we've seen is this trend of local leaders wanting to step up. And while federal immigration reform is a federal issue, integration doesn't have to be. Finding ways to better incorporate everyone in your community is something that local leaders can do, and local leaders are doing. As Liz was mentioning, they just opened up an office, and I think there's so much that you don't even know where to start sometimes, because do you focus on workforce? Do you focus on education or English classes or helping with civic engagement and citizenship? How do you get your immigrant and refugees to come to City Hall? To know who to call when their water isn't working. This is all part of making your community a place where everyone belongs and everyone can thrive and everyone feels like they're contributing. So that's really the work we've been doing, and Welcoming Week, which is this week, is so critical to the mission of our organization because it goes back to that idea of encouraging everyday people to put on events to welcome their neighbor. So a lot of our city governments are leading in the different events, but we have community groups doing it as well, whether they are potluck dinners, soccer festivals, which has been really popular, events in schools. There's, I think, like a business corner event going on in Charlotte. And we're so excited because this is the 6th year we're doing it. And there are 713 events going on across the country this week with 324 unique hosts. So which tells us that despite this negative rhetoric that we're hearing at the national level, at the local level, there's a different story. People want to roll up their sleeves and welcome their neighbor and celebrate the richness that exists in their community.
So, Liz, that's a good question, actually, that was sort of posed to you in some sense. And in setting up your new office, how do you go about the process of thinking through what the greatest needs are of the local community? And we had talked previously also about how, with Hurricane Harvey, and Dallas obviously wasn't directly impacted by the storm, but obviously saw a lot of people coming for refuge, how you approached that moment of challenge as well.
We certainly focus on priorities, right? And so we have 5, and that's where the technical assistance becomes so important. Leadership and communication, civic engagement, economic opportunity and education, safe and connected communities. All of these are intertwined. So at any juncture where you're looking at city services, you could see it from a point of how do we make this more inclusive so that everyone in our community feels like they have skin in the game. And so that's what our goal is, really, is to set it up such that we're focusing on priorities, at the same time dealing with external forces that require us to shift and pivot, et cetera. But that's sort of the game. That's the whole point of it, is to be available to our residents, to make sure that they feel welcome, and to expand relationships so that they become civically engaged. We often hear, this significant group doesn't vote, or this significant group doesn't participate. Well, you know what? Maybe you have to rethink the way you're doing your own business. And so that's why we're doing this work. As an example, perhaps, we did receive many evacuees from the Houston, Southeast Texas area, and automatically, of course, our Office of Emergency Management shifts into emergency mode and opening up 4 shelters. And so welcomed me into their operation. Liz, make sure that your office is there on site so that everybody knows this is a welcoming space. Because it was a little bit different than say, the Katrina situation. There were a lot of immigrants who were involved in the shift toward Dallas, because Houston is the #1 population in the state of Texas. It has the greatest number of immigrants living in the Houston area. Dallas is only second to Houston in that regard. So it's working with your first responders, it's working with your public safety, it's working with your local consulates. Our Mexican consulate came on board, and they were able to provide emergency relief assistance. And we were there all day from 7 a.m. to 7 at night, making sure that we were there to help people. That's just one example.
If I could add something to that, I think Liz touches upon a couple important points that we really try to stress upon as cities are looking at these issues. One is this idea of offices of immigrant affairs. Part of their job is really to work with agencies across city government. Because if we're not changing how we're delivering services, we're not doing our job, right? So in terms of making sure your frontline workers have some kind of language capability. I lived in Atlanta for a couple of years working for the mayor there, kind of building his immigrant integration initiative. And I remember going to 311 and learning they had maybe 3 phone calls in Spanish a week. That wasn't reflective of the population, which meant that we weren't doing our job to make that community aware that there was a way of getting services. I think the second point you brought up, and again, the senator mentioned this, is the building of coalitions. And it's not just the internal organizing, but the other groups outside of the community that you're bringing to the table. Because if you're thinking about creating a welcoming place and an inclusive community, it needs to be something that everyone buys into, or else it's just not going to work. So one of the best practices we really encourage communities to think about is figuring out how to bring those important stakeholders to the table as you come up with a strategic plan for the future. Really looking at some of the areas of safe and connected communities, economic empowerment, education, civic engagement, access to services, because it's really that buy-in that's going to propel a community forward and have folks thinking about where you want to be 20 years from now and 50 years from now.
Senator, one thing I was struck by in your conversation, your earlier remarks, was the effort to work with local law enforcement and work with state law enforcement as well, or sheriffs and police chiefs in California, in order to get an agreement on the Values Act. I'm struck by, I remember the press conference that was held, I think with you, with Eric Holder, with Police Chief Beck from Los Angeles, talking through the importance of the legislation, and also the sort of, again, what we're seeing in terms of shifting enforcement patterns in this administration. Winnie touched upon it in her opening remarks, that we're seeing a really, really rapid increase in arrests of collaterals, individuals who are not the targets of federal immigration enforcement actions, but who are just sort of around, people who don't have criminal convictions. Thinking about sort of the importance of the California Values Act in that environment, when you potentially have, through the end of DACA, another 800,000 individuals who could once more become unauthorized, undocumented, and subject to possible immediate arrest. We're looking also in the upcoming months at approximately 430,000 individuals who are in the country with temporary protected status. Many of whom have been here for 20 years with lawful status working, who could end up losing their protection if the administration does not extend or renew that protection. How do you think about those coalitions you've built and the importance of the California Values Act in that sort of environment, not just now, but potentially 2, 3, 4 months from now?
Well, Tom, let me put this in context with regards to the Values Act, and let me see if I can successfully complete the circle. You mentioned TPS, you mentioned DACA, the Dreamers, you mentioned those who've been in this country for a very long time, who've yet to normalize their status and become legal permanent residents, or at least temporary residents with some official work permit. When I introduced Senate Bill 54, the California Values Act, I had the former Attorney General Eric Holder review it, and the team of lawyers formerly at the Department of Justice vet it. So when I introduced it, I felt very comfortable that it could hold constitutional muster, irregardless of what Jeff Sessions says at the Department of Justice. So when they litigate, I'm sure they're going to litigate, I feel comfortable in a court of law. As we move forward through the appeal process, if we ultimately get to the U.S. Supreme Court, I don't know what the makeup will be. I don't know what the end goal, the end decision will be, but we always felt very comfortable that it was constitutional. Engaging with our local law enforcement, I think, was really critical, but in particular the police chiefs, who I give a lot of credit to. I think their mindset is different because, like I said earlier, they are of solutions-oriented as opposed to political results, amplifying and sort of polarizing the situation even more so, which does not help. It actually just hurts the situation even more so. So, working with, obviously, Police Chief Charlie Beck, Los Angeles Police Chief, second largest police force in the country after New York City, and Eric Holder, we felt that we had a very strong, legitimate case to present to the people of California, that it was imperative that we do everything within our power to protect the 98% of immigrants who are hardworking individuals who contribute greatly to our economy, to our culture, to our community, and that if in fact Trump attempts to deputize, commandeer local police officers, that in California you won't be able to do so. You may be able to do so in other states, whether it's Alabama, whether it's Mississippi, South Carolina, or elsewhere, but not in the state of California. And I would just want to give a lot of props to cities in Texas like Dallas and the leadership, the political leadership in Houston and San Antonio and Austin, because you are right, the state leadership in Texas, Greg Abbott and the Attorney General have really, and my counterpart, my peer, the leader of the Senate, who I believe is the chief author, architect of SB 4, or at least one of the biggest promoters of SB 4, we're diametrically in opposing, universes, if you will, and they have really moved forward, not just anti-immigrant measures, but measures that are really mean-spirited, that really go out of the way to hurt people. And the way we view this as a threat, because it harms our economic prosperity as a state. Now, TPS, DACA, people who have been here 10, 15, 20, 25 years who have yet to been able to legalize their status. The full circle is where we're at today, which is Washington, D.C. Washington is the source of the problem. They're the origins of the dysfunction that is being manifested in local cities, in states, and counties throughout the country, because they have not been able to get their act together in Washington, D.C. and move forward common sense, sensible measure to deal with this issue. You have many states and counties and cities throughout the country moving forward with this quilt, this patchwork of policies, some of them very draconian and very mean-spirited, like the state government of Texas and other states, and some very progressive-minded folks like in Dallas and Houston and San Antonio and Washington, D.C. and Atlanta, and obviously just virtually every city and county in California, Oregon and Washington, obviously very progressive states. Hawaii. I was just in Hawaii a couple days ago, I should say a couple weeks ago. I was there for a day and a half. And I met with the governor, two U.S. senators, and the attorney general. And I remember giving a speech in Hawaii, and I said, you guys are an incredible state because you're a state of 1.4 million. You're punching way over your weight. You probably have no more Muslims I can count on one hand or two hands in the state of Hawaii. But you are true Hawaiians, true Americans, because you believe in inclusivity. You believe that everyone should have an opportunity to succeed. And this is what America is all about. And the fact that they were the first state forward out there to sue the Trump administration on the travel ban speaks volumes to the resiliency of even small states, like a state like Hawaii, who is really standing up for immigrants and understand and recognize that they contribute greatly to our economic prosperity. The state of Iowa, my brother-in-law, who's my ex-brother-in-law now, who used to work in the slaughterhouse in Iowa. He said it was very cold there. You had you had cities and counties that were economically depressed because of demographics, because of age, and now you have folks who have revitalized these small towns and counties, and unfortunately, sadly, some folks view it as a threat. But with communication and education and bonding together, we can overcome that. The one thing is this, is that you have politicians who will walk into anywhere, even California, Texas, Midwest, southeastern cities, states, who smell economic anxiety, panic, and fear because unemployment, high unemployment, because someone perhaps lost their house, lost their wife, lost their family, lost their kids, lost everything. To numb the pain, whether it's an opiate addiction or whatever it was, and the politician walks in and smells that anxiety and fear, and instead of moving forward a proactive solution that helps improve the human condition for all individuals with quantifiable and verifiable policies to provide for economic growth, what they do is they pit one group against another group and say, you're economically depressed and despondent because of those individuals who look different, who speak different, who come from a different place than you. And that's what's torn at the fabric of who we are as a great nation. And I would say that, irregardless of who occupies the White House at this moment, this is still the greatest country on earth. And we have major challenges to overcome politically to make sure we respect inclusivity and diversity, that we don't ban it, that we don't deport it, and that we don't wall it off, because that's who we are as a great nation. And it is these local leaders at the local level and police chiefs who are forward-thinking and inclusive, who see the value and benefit. These are the great stories of this great country, irregardless, again, of who occupies the White House. So in spite of what's happening right now, I'm very bullish on this country. And it goes back ultimately to the Congress over there. They have yet to get their act together, because if they normalize the status, then we wouldn't be having these battles happening all over the country.
Chief, I was wondering if you could actually respond to a little bit of that. One thing that the Senator referred to earlier was Attorney General Jeff Sessions and the efforts to bully state and local law enforcement, for instance, into becoming more wrapped up in federal immigration enforcement duties. And I was really struck, actually, you mentioned that you had these conversations with law enforcement in California to make sure that SB 54 didn't inadvertently interfere with the ability to cooperate in anti-trafficking or counterterrorism measures. In fact, the legislation that's been advanced in Congress, the executive orders that were initially signed, specifically jeopardize precisely that kind of federal cooperation with states and localities that decided to adopt policies that would be in furtherance of their public safety mission and in compliance with the Constitution. And so just thinking about the way in which your community, I think, interacts with, as a law enforcement official, you interact with your community, and thinking about the role that the federal government can play in either helping you have a healthy relationship with your community or complicating that relationship. How do you think about what's going on right now?
I think it's sad at a state level and national level that we're legislating or attempting to legislate how local law enforcement should interact with its public in any fashion. I think our communities, law enforcement is local, no matter how you want to define it. And our communities and our city councils and our county board of supervisors dictate and create a philosophy of how they want their local law enforcement to operate, and most of it's based on the needs of the people in that particular jurisdiction. And so it's sad that there are other entities trying to come in and, in my opinion, impact and interfere with local control of local elected officials and police chiefs and sheriffs on how we administer and interact with the people we serve. But the reality is there's also a contradiction coming in our country. True community policing, the law enforcement officer taking ownership in the public that he or she serves, and that public taking ownership in that law enforcement agency. True community policing is all about relationships and creating those relationships and working together to create a safe environment in the cities and counties we work in. And so the best way to enhance that and to improve that and to perfect that is to have good relationships with the people you serve. And that goes to knowing your public, knowing your publics, and then creating those relationships. And if you have folks out there that don't trust the police, who don't understand the police, and vice versa, that impacts the efforts of enhancing the safety and security of a community. But on a federal and national level, for several years now, we've seen, for a variety of reasons, some of which are around the issues of police use of force, we've seen communities rise up and demonstrate and real friction in primarily larger, more urban areas. And every expert, every pundit, every individual has weighed in on that and said one of the reasons, or a common denominator, is that perhaps local law enforcement has not created relationships and had good communications. So on one hand, we have a national debate in some cases where law enforcement needs to do better. And I am a believer in this, in creating relationships with the people they serve. On the other side, we have a national debate on pushing people into the shadows and pushing the people away from law enforcement and impacting that ability to create those relationships. So what's it going to be? You know, or do we want to have safe communities and everybody invested Well, if that's the case, then we need to move towards good immigration reform. We need to have anybody and everybody who comes to your community in mind, who comes there to work, to live, and to play, whatever that may be, feel comfortable at their local law enforcement that we're there to serve them, and that's not the case, primarily because whether it's the DACA debate or immigration as a whole. And so for that reason, there's just a conflict there, and it's rubbing coming from a national perspective. From a local perspective, I am employed to serve anybody and everybody who comes to my community. I don't care who they are, and I don't care where they're from. I don't believe local law enforcement should be involved in immigration enforcement, and I have openly, publicly told our community that, and my mayor and my city council have never told me not to say that.
Well, that was really helpful, I think. And one thing I wanted to build off of right there at the very end, you talked about the DACA debate. We right now have sort of a ticking time bomb of what's going on, right? So the current state of play is by October 5th, any individual whose DACA will be expiring before March 5th has to have their renewal application in. We've seen an effort on the state of California recently to put, I think it was $30 million toward, in part, helping with financial assistance and also access to counsel. The state of Rhode Island recently announced they can help to provide funding for all renewal applications. So that's one very urgent deadline coming up. And then by December, essentially, I think there's going to be a building campaign and a building chorus, that exact kind of sort of large-scale coalition that you were describing, Senator, to help push for Congress to step in and provide a permanent solution for this population. And so I'm curious to hear kind of how each of you are in your current roles thinking about approaching the moment we're in, and how you've been engaging in the conversation, whether it's through talking to your local communities or thinking through practical solutions like California did, or anything of the sort. You can start with whoever I think is.
Well, is it a ticking time bomb, or is it an opportunity? I've had the occasion to speak on behalf of DACA to our federal representatives and folks on both sides of the aisle, and I have a sense that nobody wants to punish people who are here for no reason of their own, in that particular dynamic of DACA. And so, if we approach it, and if our elected officials approach it as a ticking time bomb, it's going to be a ticking time bomb. But if they approach it as an opportunity with a 6-month window to move forward and help this group of people that we're talking about under DACA, I think it's an opportunity. The issue is, as it always is no matter, and Senator, you know this better than anybody, there's going to have to be compromise. And folks are going to have to get out of their comfort zone, in my opinion, and go to an area where they may not be comfortable to create a compromise that takes care of these children and young adults. And so, I prefer to approach it from a glass half full.
Tom, let me add. The president didn't have to make this decision. There was no need to terminate DACA. He's not doing it for legal purposes. He's doing it for political purposes. Let's be very clear about that. So there's no room for ambiguity, any misinterpretation or vagueness. This is a pure political decision, not based on any legal analysis. The Department of Justice and Jeff Sessions did not want to defend this litigation through the appellate process going to the U.S. Supreme Court. Jeff Sessions is an outspoken critic of DACA or any type of immigration reform package with a compromise in any form, way, or shape. So this was unnecessary. It didn't have to do it. He didn't have to do it. And now the question becomes what happens between now and the 6 months when it does expire for a lot of these young men and women. And does the president want it both ways? In other words, he wants to eliminate it and then punt it over to the Congress saying publicly, it's on you. If you want to take care of it, take care of it, and take care of it right now. Well, to date, I haven't seen the Congress, either Paul Ryan or Mitch McConnell, able to solve any complex policy measures to date. I oppose the evisceration of the ACA. They have complete control of both the Congress, the U.S. Senate, as well as the executive branch, and they have not been able to repeal or eviscerate the ACA. And we can go through a whole laundry list. So the question is the issue of capacity. As polarizing as this issue is, how the Freedom Caucus within the Congress are going to allow Paul Ryan to move forward on any type of deal on the issue DACA I don't have that confidence. And also, too, the chief is right with regards to compromise. You do have to compromise. You ideally don't want to find yourself in a position where you're negotiating against yourself, but you also don't want to be in a position where you've negotiated against yourself and you found a temporary compromise. You won't find a permanent compromise with this Congress, the makeup. But if you find a temporary compromise, but the cost is you just had the parents removed from the country. So now the DACA young men and women are fatherless and motherless, and their moral support system structure has been completely eviscerated because that was Sophie's choice decision. I've said from day one that this is a president that you cannot negotiate with because he'll betray you in a heartbeat. And it didn't take much to see how he treated Republicans during the course of the presidential primary. There's nothing worse than a sore loser than a sore winner. And when you saw the way he treated Republican folks that he conquested, defeated, that gave you an insight, to his psychology, how he would treat everybody else. And he's being driven by forces right now that are xenophobic, that are ultra-nationalistic, that are not good for the country, that have done more in the past 50 years to tear at the fabric of who we are as a great country. So I'm not as bullish that the Congress has either A, the desire, or B, the capability to accomplish something. Because this is common sense. This is not difficult. A major accomplishment in Washington is debt ceiling. That is a huge accomplishment. If that is the modicum baseline of a major accomplishment, then it's very disappointing. This is not very difficult. This is not complex. It should be done easily. But I don't think that this administration has any desire, and I don't think that the Congress currently makeup has the capacity.
I will just say that DACA is very important to our state in Texas, our local economy, that people who have DACA protections are valedictorians, our first responders, members of the armed forces, bilingual teachers, engineers, all walks, every professional career they have gone now into. And so while I was a young attorney when it was first introduced in 2001, no longer that young attorney, these young are no longer children. Many of them, they're professionals. And they're fighting the good fight locally and nationally. We have a very vibrant youth leadership of people who have DACA in our community. And it's about what Senator said earlier about building the coalitions, that we need to form a coalition. Because as Winnie said, it's not only a moral imperative, it's an economic imperative for our communities. So that's where we are.
We can go to questions, but if you have thoughts on that one last thing.
Yeah, I mean, as to Liz's point, Dreamers are such a vital part of all the communities we work with. And I think, from our standpoint, we're trying to figure out what are the best ways to support the local leadership, whether it's great research coming out of CAP, which I think the economic information you guys have put out has been critical, particularly in places in the Rust Belt, right, where they really want to be able to point to and can point to the fact that having DACA recipients are really critical to having a population, to be perfectly frank, and keeping them is really in the best interest for the country in general, but specifically in a lot of these regions throughout the country. So we're seeing it from how can we support getting that message out, as the best speakers for this really are people on the ground.
Awesome. Well, so I think we want to open up the conversation a little bit and take some questions from the audience. The one thing we'd ask is that, in addition to keeping your questions concise, you please start off with your name and affiliation. So sure. Okay, yes. Yes.
A wonderful presentation. The thing I'm concerned with is the word federalism, which no one uttered. Suppose the courts rule that those states that want to grant citizenship to DACA and refuse to let local law enforcement be federal deputized by federal by the Justice Department have the right to do so, and those states that would deny citizenship for DACA and have no objection to their local law enforcement, essentially deputized as federals have the right to do so, and see what happens. What would the consequences of this federalistic approach be? I personally think that local law enforcement should never be deputized, and that DACA people should have the right to citizenship. But suppose the Supreme Court rules that on this federalistic approach.
Well, you pose an intriguing question. I'm not either a constitutionalist or an expert when it comes to federalism. I know that federalism was used quite successfully on behalf of the state of Texas. Greg Abbott, that's the name, Abbott?
Paxton.
Yeah, and Ken Paxton, the Attorney General, the AG, against the Obama administration. Obviously, they were the lead litigators on DACA, was a state, Texas enlisting many other states throughout the country. You pose it's a it's a double-edged sword. If that were to come to fruition at the U.S. Supreme Court level, those states that respect and believe that by including hardworking immigrants who obey our laws and who are tax-paying residents and pledge allegiance to this flag, that we can confer per the Constitution either a legal residency or we can't confer U.S. naturalization citizenship. That cannot be done unless there's a constitutional change. But on the flip side, for those states who may not be as forward-thinking, as inclusive, or moving forward draconian measures, it's a very good question. I think that's happening already, right now, as we speak. It's being manifested in different ways throughout the country, and I think this is a reflection of the values of politicians on the spectrum, whether it's on the left or the right, and I want to give credit to there's a handful of Republicans in both chambers here who are very supportive vocally for DACA, but the very hard extreme right have influenced disproportionately the debate from within the GOP and have commandeered, if you will, and hijacked, if you will, the policy debates that have made other Republicans sort of cower, if you will, in fear of being ostracized by the leadership, by those who have the financial resources to move forward an agenda. You pose a very intriguing question. I don't know necessarily if that will ever come to fruition, but it's a legitimate question to ask.
Oh, sure. Go ahead. Oh, yes, it's coming. Sorry.
Thank you very much. June O'Connell, a former immigration attorney. I kind of like to challenge the senator's statement that Washington is the problem. I don't disagree with that, except that it's fed by apathy of the voters in the various states. Either a congressman or senator believes that the people who didn't vote for him or her don't matter because after the election they go away and they're silent. And senators and congressmen are more worried about the Koch brothers than they are their constituents. So with the ACA debate previously, we saw people who didn't vote for Dana Rohrabaugh try to get him to a town hall meeting. And so to me, yes, there's a problem in Washington, but it's, I want you to comment on the fact that isn't it emboldened by essentially the apathy of the various peoples?
Well, whether folks are apathetic to a whole variety of issues, whether it's the environment, whether it's climate change, whether it's healthcare, what's the issue of immigration, I do believe it's incumbent on the policymakers, the lawmakers from both sides of the aisle to move forward on this agenda. They shouldn't be driven by the poll numbers or driven by, constituent calls or, visits, town halls, et cetera. This has been a lingering issue for decades. So out of fairness, there's blame to be spread across the board, without question. And I recognize with the Dreamers and DACA under then President Barack Obama, who through an executive order authorized it, it was the Dreamers themselves, at a grassroots movement who really moved this, up the vertical political chain. But I don't think apathy is, and I'm respectful of your perspective, I just don't believe apathy is a justification to do the right thing. We see an issue that is poll after poll, quantitative research, even among Republicans prior to the election of President Trump through the Electoral College, even among Republicans, they said, we agree. Bring folks out from the shadows. They're law-abiding, tax-paying residents already. They've been here for decades. Let's just normalize them and get over with, because they're here and they're not going anywhere else. Now we have a Trump administration who has highly politicized this situation to further divide this country, as if we deport and separate mothers from their children, that will be the panacea to all of our economic ills, that somehow, some way the air will get cleaner, that some way the water will be safer to drink, and that there will be economic prosperity, from Midwest to the Rust Belt to Central Valley in California and elsewhere. We know that's a false promise, that's a false narrative. And stoking the flames of hatred and division doesn't serve this country well. We've seen it in the past, and I can say through experience from Proposition 187 with the Republicans, it's a short-term Pyrrhic victory. It comes at a very high cost. If I would say to my friends in the GOP here at the national level, it doesn't end up well for you. In the long run, it's not going to end up well for you. You're going to cash in with the short-term victories, but they're going to be Pyrrhic victories. They'll be at a very high cost. And I don't say this as a partisan or as a leader of the Senate in California or as a Democrat. I see this objectively. I witnessed what happened in California. In California, we sent Ronald Reagan, a Republican, to become president of the United States. We sent Richard Nixon, a U.S. Senator Republican, to become president of the United States. We have had Pete Wilson and many other U.S. Senators Republicans, as well as governors. Pete Wilson, Duke Majan, Ronald Reagan, whole slew, Arnold Schwarzenegger, although he's a very liberal, a Republican. That has changed. And the bellwether was Proposition 187. That changed the whole dynamic completely, because people were so put off, so offended, that you would go out of your way to provide simplistic solutions to very complex issues and not be upfront with the people. Republicans or Democrats, or those who are agnostic altogether, and are not partisan. We need real economic solutions to deal with economic pain that many communities, whether it's the Midwest, the Southeast, Rust Belt, parts of California as well, folks need help. But not to pit one group against another, because that is not going to solve any of our ills. So I know that was a long-winded answer. Obviously, I apologize, to your question. I went around it, but I think that, again, just getting back, I don't think apathy should be the driver or lack thereof, to get the job done and do what you need to do. It's your responsibility. That's why you're here.
Well, on that's sort of a charge. I think we unfortunately don't have time for more questions, but I do want to thank everyone for coming to the event. I want to thank our panelists very much, and the Senator for even the keynote address. If you want to follow along afterwards, obviously you can see sort of the discussion. We will have an archived video of this as well on the website, and thank you very much for coming.